If you're working with Al on an exercise, expect the unexpected.
Wow, thank
He's
you,
a magnet
Chris.
for it. Yeah.
The Bermuda Triangle of exercise planning and facilitation.
If anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. Well,
Yeah.
anyway, you know what time it is? That's right. A time for another episode of Readiness Rewired, a healthcare podcast. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I'm Chris.
I'm Al.
And I'm Mike.
And I think today's topic, we were going to talk about something of recent historical significance, and that is some of our exercises that may have gone sideways with some unintended, unexpected incidents occurring with them. And I think Al, we decided was winner chicken dinner on this one, and had a handful of them. So Al, you want to kick it off with maybe introducing a scenario or two, and Mike and I'll jump in with some questions and comment.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And as I thought about that and we were preparing for this, I thought, wait a minute, exercises that went sideways, and you guys didn't have as many examples. And I went, does that say something about my emergency preparedness skill level that several things went sideways? But hey, things happen, and it's okay. We learn from the good and we learn from the bad. But yeah, let's talk about a few things that I've run into, and maybe you guys have as well, and maybe our listeners, both emergency preparedness and the general community that's been involved in things have seen and been involved in. We had an airport exercise. The airports around our areas have to exercise every 3 years with a real full-scale exercise. So the planning on that is pretty intense, and the community is very involved. I mean, law enforcement, fire, EMS, public health, the hospitals all around the areas. In fact, we have hospitals from a little further out that want to participate because they don't normally get to do things with the airport. And then the airport goes through and sets up a very intricate drill over there with, the plane crash or something, and they do triaging and treatment of the patients and getting them ready to go to the hospitals. They do a tremendous job moulaging the patients. And for those that don't know what moulaging is, it's just painting the victims up with the blood and the cuts and everything like they really existed. So when they report to the hospital, or they're looking for their triage from the EMS provider, there's some visual signs and cues that people can use as well. Well, this all went well, and it's a well-planned exercise. And at the hospital, we were prepared and ready to go, and we had our list because ahead of time we said, here's how many victims, red, yellow, green we want, and that's the triage colors of how severe the victim is for treatment. So we worked through all of that, and all the other hospitals did, and we came up with our list, and our ED staff and even the doctors were very excited to participate in that. So we had the areas set up, and again, we're not worried about practicing setting up our areas. We're worried about, triaging and treating and keep the flow going of patients and everything. It was working out well. Now, what we didn't plan on as an exercise team in the whole is the weather. And at the airport, they're outside doing all these exercises. And even though they're preparing at 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, it was one of the hottest days in the year that the drill was going to happen. And I mean, it was sweat at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it's like, that could be problems. So, well, we're gonna go on, and we'll continue on with it. Well, as the exercise got going, we were hearing rumblings of, hey, there's a lot of victims, a lot of volunteers that were victims, and of course, in a lot of exercises, who are your volunteers? Well, unless you get high school kids, which it was a school day, so we couldn't do that. There was a lot of elderly that were volunteering, and it didn't matter how old they were. This might be a 16-year-old male with this kind of problem, whatever. Well, it got so hot early on that a lot of the volunteers said, I'm tapping out. I don't want anything to do with this severe heat. So they're scrambling at the airport to get enough victims. Now, we're at the hospital expecting I think we asked for 15, 18 victims to do triaging and treatment and everything for, along with our regular busy emergency department anyway. And we got our staff, we've got the areas set up, we've got our disaster card out and everything, and nobody's coming. Nobody's coming. And then one dribbles in. It's like, okay, we're getting ready to go. And then nobody's coming. And then another one dribbles in. I think we ended up with...
Hey, Al,
Yes.
when you say dribbles in, you mean just slowly comes in.
Slow.
You don't.
Thank you. Yes, no.
Okay,
Slow.
just clarification. As an elderly person myself, I want to make sure I'm clear in the picture that I'm coming up with of the.
Wow. Thanks.
Scenario.
I wasn't picturing that, but thank you. Yeah, no. Slowly coming in. And I was calling around. I was trying to keep the thing rolling at the hospital, calling around, hey, when are we going to get our victims? And I think we ended up only getting 4 or 5 victims from the scene. The rest of them, I mean, no blame on the team. It was too hot, and the volunteers were elderly or more, the older group. They just didn't want to get out in that heat and risk anything else of a real event, So I think it reminded us, and we talked about it as a team, because the team was disappointed at the hospital that they had prepared for this. They were so amped up and excited. But we talked about, you know what? It's a good lesson learned. Have a plan B for victims. Now we could have easily, and we've done it before in other exercises, had victims staged at the hospital, or we've got an ambulance service right by the emergency department. And we've had victims staged there before. We've had them moulaged up, ready to go, and we had no problems inserting them in there. Well, we didn't do that this time because we were relying on this bigger community drill, and it just went south a little bit. Now, again, anything that goes bad, you try to learn, but it was an eye opener for us, that don't always depend on others. Count on yourself to make sure you dot all those I's, cross all those T's in that exercise, even if you're not the primary planner and you're not the primary focus. The airport was the primary focus at this time, so it was interesting. Always have a plan B, and as I talk about, because I use that plan B kind of thing in active shooter when I do some education and awareness training. You don't just have a plan B. There's 26 letters in the alphabet. Plan C, Plan D, Plan E. I mean, you do what you want, because make sure that the exercise fits what you're intending to do at your facility. Interesting, guys. Any comments, thoughts?
I like the Plan B, Plan C thing too. One of our docs, she was a female pediatrician who's PZER, and she always has this folder with her when we did these things. And what was inside this folder were a lot of the things she developed, which were patient profiles, paper patient profiles. And so she always had this kit with her where if we needed to throw some more potential patients into the mix, even though if it was a paper patient, she had them with her everywhere. And it just seems like she always was ready to throw some stuff in if we needed it. And sometimes you got to have that, right?
Yeah. And Mike, I know who you're talking about because you've allowed me to come out, and she is awesome. And she's always spot on. So that doesn't surprise me that she would be prepared. But again, now, we became a little more prepared too.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and I think we had a a similar incident involving an airport exercise fairly recently prior to my retirement, where we ended up not getting any patients at all as well. And there was actually, they were testing a new communications platform, and I tried to circle around and figure out what the problem was and never got that communication. So it really speaks to, and I, again, for the listeners that may not be familiar, we use the words drill and exercise interchangeably, but really what you're talking about, the scale of it, the complexity, and the moving parts is an exercise. And you can drill parts of the exercise. And in my case, I think the downfall was we didn't get a chance to really drill the communications part. Test it out, test that one part out, make sure it worked. And I think most of us, when we're planning exercises, and when we've taken, I think we all took the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program at one point, which is a 2-day workshop talking about putting together exercises. They talk about being able to interrupt an exercise if something real world occurs, right? And to avoid confusion with the players in the exercise, you use those words, this is a real world emergency, meaning that it's not part of the scenario. And so I think about some of the things we think about and plan for. But in this day and age, when you're working with community partners and you have as many exercises, now I don't know how many exercises and drills your facility was involved with. And in mine, we looked at doing monthly drills that had a topic that was related to our hazards vulnerability analysis, or the annual review of our highest risk hazards. And then in addition to that, we had actual incidents that we would do after action reports on and treat sort of like an exercise from the standpoint of how could we improve on it. Then we also had exercises, at least the 2 a year that most CMS providers have to do at least every other year. And just to stay in practice, I think went and stuck with the annual, if I'm not mistaken, I think currently nursing homes have to, and long-term care facilities have to do those exercises every year. And most of the other 17 providers CMS defines as needing to adhere to their requirements have to do them every other year. But those two, I think a lot of people plan for just those two, but then when you have community partners that need them, it's easy to get caught up in, planning and multitasking and not being able to even consider things like, hey, the weather, what are you guys going to do if you weather out? So, the other thing that comes to mind, Al, maybe you can address is, what if you had those planned patient actors, and then you also had some of the folks that were, had heat illness injury, that created a lot bigger surge than maybe you were even planning for.
And that's a great idea. And that's kind of the takeaways that talking with you guys and talking with others as we do a debrief and do a hot wash, which are some of the terms we use to kind of sum up and say, hey, what happened? Those are great comments, Chris. We didn't talk about that particular one, but I'm gonna, even now I'm connected with the hospital a little bit. We'll throw some of that stuff in there because you're right. It's part of that unintended incident that happens, and that was a really good one, because if it truly happened that day, we'd have had a lot of heat related issues with those people. Now, funny you should say that, because when you talked about the no victims at the exercise you had with the airport and the artificiality type of thing, we had another incident at a college where it was on the other side of the river from where I'm at. But again, I have hospitals on both sides of the river. We were planning a big college exercise over there. And again, the community came together, did planning really well. We even talked about some things of, hey, let's make sure we get these patients to the hospitals to split them up so we can test them all. And sure enough, drill comes that day, or the exercise comes that day. starts off, and we're at the hospital. This is a different hospital that I have in the area, and we're out there waiting for patients, and we're waiting and we're waiting and we're waiting, and the exercise is pulling off, and the exercise is going flawlessly. And I mean, and this is at a college, so they had a ton of students that were excited to participate and be victims. And we didn't see anything, and didn't see anything, and didn't see anything. Well, finally got a hold of people and said, "Hey, what's going on?" "Oh, well, there's a closer hospital to the college, so the triage, or I'm sorry, the transport officer just started sending them to the hospital closest, and the hospital said, we can take them all. So they took them all." And it's like, but the artificiality was they weren't supposed to take them all. We all were supposed to participate and be able to play in the exercise. And let me tell you guys, so we address that after the fact, but let me tell you, I had another emergency department nurse and doctors and manager, ED manager there, and they were all very upset because they had done all this. They were pissed. I said, I don't blame you guys. I said, I take that upon myself, although we had talked about it in the exercise to make sure that didn't happen, and that message just didn't get relayed that day. But they were really pissed that they couldn't participate in the exercise, and it was kind of like a wasted day. And again, lesson learned. We've addressed that since then, and we've had several other meetings and several other exercise-related type things. That has not happened since. But again, I said, okay, it happened. Good. Now we know. Now it's on our radar screen, if you will, so we can make sure that that's another piece that works out well.
You know what that might illustrate too is something that I remember we've always said was a problem is communication from the scene to the ED. Mm-hmm. And so direct communication with the transport officer, who is usually an EMS provider sitting at the scene, making the decisions on who goes where and how many go where. Do they have direct voice, radio, or cellular contact with the emergency department? And so everybody knows what's going on. And I can see that, that's been an issue with us. A lot of times either they don't take the time to make the communication, or the communication wasn't there, or something happened. And so I think that illustrates maybe one of those issues that we always know is that when in an exercise, more than likely communication has been or will be one of the issues.
Yeah.
Interesting too, because I think that one of the challenges with that communication, I mean, that's sort of the traditional model, right? Is that EMS will designate a transportation officer, and they're to have an idea of what facilities have what beds available, and then allocate patients accordingly. That's such a dynamic process anymore. I know of at least one major metropolitan area that has gone to making sure that there's an EMS provider that goes to every hospital emergency department and stands by to help monitor those communications. And then also a medical coordination center stood up that helps monitor bed availability and actually does a lot of the behind the scenes diversion and reallocation and load balancing. I think it's a difficult thing for EMS providers who are so focused at the scene with the mess and then just trying to get it, get folks out of there. In some exercises, when they have the time, they don't have the distraction, and there are artificialities, I think they're better able to manage that. But in real life, in truth, in Las Vegas, the mass shootings in Las Vegas and Orlando and so on, EMS is only transporting about 20%, right? That a lot of the patients are self-transporting, and the load balancing is not really a planned thing or an inevitability. It's where the patients choose to go, and then you have EMS providers potentially having to move patients between facilities, interfacility, during a disaster just because capabilities aren't recognized by the public and they show up there. So, Al, when you designed your exercise and the number of patients, was EMS involved and understood that there's going to be this distribution? And I'm assuming that you probably had that traditional model where that transportation officer made the decision and then sent the patients, and that the hospitals probably weren't all monitoring the EMS channel that
Right.
was being used, because a lot of times that's a TAC channel, Mike, right? You can't monitor it because it's assigned and it's made private so that they can keep that channel clear. So I think that, Al, it really points out to a real interesting dilemma beyond the exercise, but the reality is, how do we excuse me, better allocate patients in a disaster?
Right.
And
Right.
I think the HON radio, the health alert network radios that most states have and hospitals have and public health have needs to probably be better utilized, not to just get the communications one way from state authorities, but between facilities and kind of work. One of the things we try to encourage our EMS providers to do is, somebody needs to make a call back to a hospital, any hospital. That hospital then should notify other hospitals and help them with that bed availability thing, so that you don't have an EMS provider, up to their ass and alligators, so to speak, in terms of a disaster scene, trying to call hospitals, find out what they have for beds and so on. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, it does. And to answer your question, yes, during the planning and all the discussions ahead of time, EMS was very involved. In fact, the two major ambulance services, I have very good connections with both of them, and they were there, and we sat at the same table and planned, and we work a lot together. So what happened was, on the day of the exercise, the person who was transportation officer was handed that position, as the other EMS people that were at the meeting were doing other things, and that's just a piece that got forgotten. It was missed. And I
But what I like about it, Al, though, is it really points out what in real life is a possibility of happening, right? Because you had somebody that wasn't part of the exercise, that was an EMS provider, that made that kind of decision. So again, to go back to your earlier statement, what was Plan B for the hospitals? If they're
Yeah.
all going to one facility, how do they redirect? How do they divert, and so on? So I think that's
Yeah.
difficult. Mike, you worked at a large tertiary care institution. Do you guys ever look at diverting patients if you had a large scale incident, or was it, you will make room for everybody, and that's kind of the mindset that staff had?
Well, we had to do both. I mean, when we did an exercise that at least involved the community, we have 3 hospitals in the community. And so we try to make sure that, we the tertiary care facility, we want all your criticals, give me your reds and whatnot. If the other facilities can take the load off of us with the yellows and the greens, the intermediately ill and injured and the, walking wounded, if you will, then that leaves our staff more available to service the folks who really need the skill level of a tertiary care facility. So we tried to plan these things. We tried to work with the 3 hospitals and actually make decisions ahead of time that, hey, in general, give us your reds, give us your bad ones, and then try to have the other ones go the other direction. But we all know that doesn't work out. They're going to come walking into wherever, right? So at least in exercises, we try to do that, and it doesn't always work out really well.
Well, at some point we need to go over triage as probably a separate topic, because, the red, green, yellow, and black, I think now has been expanded in many areas to 5 different levels, and the process is very much in question. So that would be something worth a deeper dive than this particular podcast. But that triage or sorting of patients that's done by EMS is done based on their capabilities. They end up at a hospital's doorstep with a tag that really reflects that EMS decision. And then I think hospitals take that color and just automatically assume that that's their red patient, if you will, their most critical patient. Sometimes they have to really should look at re-triaging based on their capabilities. And an interesting area we needed to, like I said, explore. But it sounded like just on sheer volume was how many patients total, just curious, how many patients total were in your exercise that ended up going to one hospital?
I think probably.
Do you remember?
Well, I'm going to guess roughly, but between the reds, the criticals, the yellows, the and the green, the walking wounded, I think we probably had 15 or 20. But again, didn't have enough red critical patients to overwhelm the hospital. So they were saying, "Oh, well, no, we can take the other ones. We can take and we'll triage and we'll treat them." And so we had enough victims lined up, I think, to test. And maybe it was 20, 25, but yeah, they just all got sucked into this big black hole from where we were sitting and kind of disappeared. But I like your Triage EMS podcast idea, and we can talk offline because we've got some EMS guys that we're all and I say guys and gals that we're all familiar with that I think would love to come on and have some conversations with us. So I wrote that down too, Chris. We can talk about that. That's a great idea. But I want to get back to, you mentioned the term, the real world emergency if something happens during an exercise. And a funny story, another one related to an exercise, at the hospital, we've gone away from the secret squirrel codes of, code silver, and which sounds like a jewelry sale in the cafeteria. And code silver, at least at our facility, used to be an active shooter. Well, we now, we announce active shooter because we want everybody to be aware. But the one thing we haven't gone to in a true plain language was bomb threat. And our CEO brought up a very good point. He said, well, it could be a false bomb threat. Let's not panic everybody, but let's have a process in place. So we stayed with our code search. And once the code search identifies something that all the staff have their responsibilities to do, then we announce a bomb threat, and then we take evasive action. And by that time, the law enforcement, everything's there. But I was planning an exercise, and I had the little backpack with the wires sticking out and everything ready to go, and had the signs around, and the executive team knew I was going to do a code search, and they said, "Oh, that's great. We need to do that." And I said, "Okay, it's going to come up within the next few weeks. I'm still tweaking some stuff, working on some things." And I come into work one day, and I hear over the loudspeaker, "Code search," and they announced the campus and everything, and I'm going, what the hell? I didn't activate that. So I called the security manager, and he goes, "No, it's a real code. It's a real bomb threat that was called in." And so I come ripping down the hallway, and I run into one of the executives, and she looks at me and she says, "Al, are you doing a code search? I thought you were going to let us know when that happened." I said, This is not an exercise. This is a real event." And boy, I'll tell you, there was a lot of people scrambling, and luckily it turned out very well. At the time, I was very impressed because our CEO was at the particular campus where it was happening, and he took charge and was doing things and working with law enforcement, and we got it all sorted out, and luckily it was just a scare. But it was certainly one of those things where the timing of that planned exercise and the timing of the real event just kind of come crashing together, and it was an eye opener. It was funny. So when you talk about that real world emergency, we had one that we hadn't really planned on.
Sometimes fate intervenes and allows you to, I suppose, call attention to the emergency management program in your facility. Mm-hmm. And then everybody starts to think, well, maybe all these ideas he has to do these exercises isn't such a bad idea when you have a real world one to come up with. So like Chris said in our last podcast, don't ever want to waste a good disaster. Don't ever want to waste a good, supposed emergency.
Yeah. And we say that cynically. We don't want people to believe that we really think disasters are a good thing just because we get a chance to play with all of our plans and resources. It's just an opportunity to capture their attention and provide some direction. Hey, Al, on that code search, what do you do for missing persons? Are they you use the same code overhead page,
No,
or do you
it
call
is
it
a
something
missing.
else?
No, it is a missing. At our facility, it is a missing person, and we go through the description of what they're wearing. You know, all the things we can to help identify. It's kind of like, it's kind of like the. Oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the other one that we do. But we describe as much as possible. But no, code search. We don't want to panic everybody right away. The other people, if we've got a missing person, we want everybody in the facility to be helping us out. It's kind of like the pediatric abduction or the infant abduction. You know, it used to be some fancy, foofy little name, and everybody went, well, we're not an employee here, so we don't know. Now we announce, and we do exercises a lot on infant abduction or child abduction. So everybody's aware, and everybody's watching, and everybody's stopping and asking and making sure, because the general public, the families that are in there visiting their loved ones in the hospital, really want to help as much as they can. You know, they don't want anything happening bad at the hospital. That's and to that, I'll step into, you know, the critical access hospitals that I was working with. You know, we do the infant abduction or child abduction drill at the bigger hospitals where we had a pediatric department or we had an OB area. But I said to the critical access in an emergency management meeting, I said, hey, I want to do an infant abduction or a child abduction drill down here. Oh, we don't have those departments. I said, I know that. But you have kids that come in with grandma to visit mom, or come in with mom to visit grandpa in the hospital. And they went, yeah, you're kind of right. So we set that up and went through, did some preliminary training. So, because we don't want to catch everybody off guard. We want them to learn from their mistakes, but we don't, you know, and we're not saying do everything perfect, but we learned a lot from that exercise we ran at a critical access hospital when we announced it. A lot of things opened up for us. We identified new doors that weren't marked or weren't marked with alarm systems that should have been, how to get out, how to look for things. It was very interesting. But again, you're right. As we do some of the exercises, the executive team goes, oh, now I get why we're doing that, because you're right. You know, in this particular critical access, God bless them. They're one of my best supporters of emergency preparedness, and they just did a tremendous job that day. And then going back and teaching the staff, hey, here's why we need to do it, and here we need to be as much on guard as anyone.
Yeah, there's part of what you're addressing in both of those scenarios, the code search and the code missing person. Do you call the pediatric same thing, missing person with a description, or you call it infant abduction, or
it's child abduction, infant abduction? Yeah, because if a little one wanders off, they're just not missing. We want to be very careful, but the
that's not an
missing
abduction.
person.
But that's not an abduction either. I mean, right?
Well, we
Semantics
don't
would be
know
important.
That. Yeah, we
Right,
don't
right.
know
So
that
I'd be
at
careful.
the time. Yep.
I'd be careful of using abduction, right, too. I mean, that's the thing, is you start to get into these, and it's like wordsmithing is important.
Yeah.
The communication that you mentioned, not just to the staff that are going to participate, but I cannot imagine how big of a communication issue it is to alert, kind of from a safety standpoint. And Mike, this would probably be a huge thing for you with the multiple buildings and potentially thousands of staff, but you have administrators, you have staff, you have students, you have volunteers, visitors, patients, you have, just visiting public, social media, public safety folks, local officials that, if they're not aware that it's an exercise, or that it's an exercise, but now you have a real incident, and they inadvertently hear about things, those are also opportunities for exercises to do refinement. I know we did when we were talking about active shooter response and targeted shooting response and sheltering in place. is when you turn off the lights and you tell a patient to be quiet, and you're doing that during a drill. It's like, why should I be quiet? You mean there is an active shooter, or there could be an active shooter here? That scripting, working with your staff to come up with short scripting, and sometimes even printing that on cards and letting people practice with it's important. So you have a whole bunch of folks that are in your planning committee, potentially for your exercise. Then you have a whole lot of folks that you have to notify. And I think one of our biggest ones when we do some of these exercises, when we look at missing persons or a bomb threat, it was that we would also further restrict our building. And that's basically locking doors. Well, we have physicians in and out all the time from clinics. And if they don't know there's an exercise, they're pulling on that door, yanking on that door, saying, I need to get in. And during an exercise, someone will let them in. But the communication really is, what if they're yanking on that door and, it's the real deal? Are you still going to let them in? I mean? It brings up a lot of dynamic, like mini topics to get through. So I think introducing that concept that yes, you could have a missing person, it's unlikely, but then how do you manage it? How do you communicate?
The communications piece of this, we have to rely on, real world technology nowadays. And you mentioned something about a size of a facility. Not everything's done with overhead paging anymore. And you just don't do that. So everybody doesn't always hear it. And so there's certain things you don't want to put on overhead paging, and there's certain things you use other technologies. And so, with these clinical apps that are out there now where you have, like an iPhone, which has got a specific clinical communications app on it that's, HIPAA compliant, and that most of your major practitioners and nursing staff and whatnot have one of these. We've issued these all over the facility. And so the ability to alert staff of certain things can be done in a more controlled fashion through these types of alerting technologies. Okay, so we take advantage of those things. There's also those ability to, if you're sitting in front of a screen in your computer, our IT department has the ability to go in and put a banner instantly across that screen in red with big letters, blah, 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 and lays out the situation. So using that platform, we have digital signage in every major lobby, elevator lobby, main lobby, whatever, where it's not an overhead paging, it's tied into our fire system, where you can have a digital message scrolling across that everybody can see, okay, or if you're in that facility. So lighting that off as well, and then of course all of our staff and, food service people and security and housekeeping and everything. They all have walkie-talkies, engineering people. So there's ways of alerting people through a broadcast, through the walkie-talkie system. And then if you really need to go big, and now you've got your mass notification system, where in emergency management, I had access to the campus-wide mass notification system, but we had it partitioned off to only the healthcare campus. The healthcare staff would receive messaging. And so I could actually send out alerts. We used that during some of our rioting that we had, where we had staff trying to leave the facility or trying to come back into the facility when there could be potential problems with large gatherings and protesters causing damage and things like that. So we'd alert them through that process. So I think the point being, sometimes, you have to think about the different technologies that you have available to you to actually notify people of certain situations. And sometimes you might choose to use some of those and not all, or, whatever. But overhead paging is not for everything anymore, in my opinion.
No, good point.
And there's redundancies too. You need backups if the power is out, what systems are being impacted. But I'd say, to kind of balance that is that team-based responses where you have specific teams that are targeted to respond. Select technologies are good. But if we're not having some larger scale or more carefully coordinated communications, your public information officer doesn't know what's going on and isn't monitoring social media and isn't in a position to really, proactively help manage some aspects of an incident that are developing. Going back to Al and the exercises, if you don't involve community partners, you don't communicate ahead of time with law enforcement, somebody that hears something going on during an exercise may call public safety, and you may end up with unintended consequences there. So absolutely right. Communications is a really dynamic, often overlooked aspect of exercises. So great point.
Yeah. Well, let me jump in with one other, because when you talked about the unintended incidents and things, it reminds me also a subject we haven't talked about, but we work on it all the time, is our MOUs, our memorandums of understanding. And those are agreements with vendors that can help us provide water, fuel, other resources to the hospital. And we have those as a backup. So if we ever lose our source, they can come in and help. And everybody, we've been doing that for years. We signed the memorandum of understanding with all the different vendors. We go out and we update it, and everybody was wondering, I don't know, it's not a commitment by the vendor, but it's just hey, we'll do the best we can, and that's all we can do. But at one of our critical access hospitals in a small community, we were notified. I happened to be around that area, and we were notified, hey, we just lost water in the city. Well, as we got checking into it, picture this. This is a small little community. The computer system at the water company went down, and the water tank in the community, the big ass water tank sitting in the town, went dry. Bone dry, because the computer missed and it didn't send a signal to keep shooting water in there. The city was out of water. Well, the hospital's out of water. Well, he said, don't worry, and we got there. We had updated our memorandums of understanding. We pulled up the water one. We contacted the company, and it was really coordinated from our primary hospital down the road 30 miles, and contacted the vendor, and the person who had signed the agreement was on vacation. The wonderful lady who was working in the office said, what are you talking about? I don't know anything about an agreement to bring you water. What are you talking about? And it was just like, wow. It kind of pointed out to us that we can set those things up, but we have to do a little more making sure that we remind people, hey, educate your office staff. So when we call in, we had to actually bring in tankers of water, hook it up to our system, and get the hospital back filled with water. Bring in bottled water for drinking, and it's important to flush the toilets, but to have the cooling and heating systems with the chillers, have water. It all worked, but it took a little bit of time because we caught the vendor office person off guard a little bit, and she had to make a few quick calls to make sure she was doing something right. All worked out, but again, it was one of those unintended incidents that we knew we had it lined up on our end, but it wasn't quite as smooth on the vendor end. All worked out in the long run, and I think we were back up with water in the city in, I want to say 2.5, under 3 days, but it took that long. So, we were bringing in tankers of water to keep our hospital open and viable.
So not an exercise, but a real world example of something that probably isn't exercise, and that's the use of the MOUs, the memorandums, or the MOAs, memorandums of agreement that organizations have, right? And I think that supply chain thing, since COVID, has become an even bigger deal. The redundancy, again, going back to your initial statement, have a plan A, have a plan B, have a plan C. Who has those contacts, who's their backup, and how do you get a hold of them, and what's your backup if they're not able to provide service to you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and there's no way you can communicate. You can control communication at the vendor level. So that was an example of communication failure again that unfortunately you had no control over.
Right.
And so it's like, well, an MOU or an MOA, there probably is. They've always said, they're worth about the paper they're written on.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I would. Speaking to that, so before people start trashing all their MOUs, I mean, it's walking through a process and saying, hey, who does provide this, and how would we get this? So, I know we've had a couple of bouts of water service disruption over the years, very significant ones in our community, and one of them we discovered was, there are alternative sources of water, but how do they connect to our hospital? The actual manner in which they physically connect. Same thing with power. If you're looking at one of these portable generators, it's like, well, that's great, but how does it actually physically connect to your facility? So, it's worth an exercise, and again, using our principle, Mike, that you were alluding to, never waste a good disaster, is immediately after that would be a great time to say, hey, let's look at some of these and let's really drill down and say, practically speaking, how are we going to tackle that? That's really business continuity, right? Operational continuity, and something that I think hospitals and businesses in general, again, post-COVID, are really being asked to take a deeper dive in and look at what is your solid redundancy plans and continuity of operations concerns.
Okay, I had a situation that come to mind where we were involved in an exercise that was a fairly high level, and it had the media involved. And so our DHS, or Department of Health and Human Resources region, same as the FEMA regions, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. So, in our region, they decided they wanted to do a biocontainment transport exercise, because one of the things, and this will be something for future podcasts, that each region has at least one maintained, federally supported biocontainment unit that would be used in case there would be need for care of a highly infectious pathogenic disease process, such as Ebola, for example. So we have one in our region, and then our facility was their backup. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to do a transport exercise, because from some, these regions are multi-state, right? So some of the transport times of patients to try to get a patient who potentially either has or has been confirmed to have a highly pathogenic disease could be a very long, prolonged transport time. And the region took a situation where there's a major metropolitan area in the south part of the region that is 7 hours by ground to our regional biocontainment unit. And it's like, boy, 7 hours is a tough transport when you're all gowned up and, going through all the rigmarole. We can talk about at some future point of being able to do this kind of biomedical transport capability thing. Well, at any rate, they had an exercise where they said, okay, that's too far. We're going to take them to this closer backup unit. And they actually put a patient in a capsule called an isopod in an ambulance and brought them from that major metropolitan center south into another state on their way to our facility. And it was a 5-hour transport. And they actually had to use 2 different ambulances to lateral the patient up because of crew fatigue and fuel and things like that. Well, anyway, long story short, we've got all the powers that be here at our facility waiting to watch how this all happens. We had NETEC, the National Emerging Pathogens Training and Education Center representatives. We had the regional representatives there. We had the news media, television crews waiting for this arrival so that we could educate the public on how all this works. Well, and then, of course, we had our team. I was the operations manager of our biocontainment unit. We had our operations team ready to go to do the transfer of the patient in our ambulance bay. We had our nursing staff down there with the bed that the patient's going to be on. They're all gowned up head to toe with full personal protective gear on and ready to go. Well, nobody thought, and I didn't think, to ask how much the patient weighed. We go to transfer this patient from their stretcher to our hospital bed, and I've got sort of I've got three small statured biocontainment trained nurses ready to try to move this patient. And the patient ends up being about 6'4", maybe about 240 pounds or so, in this capsule, inflatable this capsule thing that isolates him. And I'm looking at this, television cameras are rolling, all the powers that be are watching it. And I'm thinking, there's no way in God's green earth, not even with a board to slide the patient on, are my nurses going to be able to move that patient from, that stretcher onto ours. And I just, at some point in some exercises, sometimes you got to call timeout. And I just called timeout and I said, this is not safe. The nurses that are here, we didn't know this patient was so big. We would have had more resources available to move them. And I said, so we're not going to risk any injury to our nursing staff. And so we basically then said, all right, dude, we're just going to move you on here and get a bunch of people to move you onto our cart, and said, all right, we put a pause on this exercise because we realistically cannot maintain, safety, biocontainment, because we don't have enough personnel ready for this exercise. So that was the one thing that came to mind for me. And that was, like I said, pretty embarrassing because, you got television cameras and you've got powers that be sitting there watching, and you had to put a halt to the whole thing. And it just happens. Just didn't know the patient was going to be so big.
Well, and you bring up a great point, Mike. You were embarrassed, but if I was an observer watching there, I'd go, wait a minute, safety first. And these guys practice safety. And that's the point for everybody is if something's going a little south in an exercise, it's an exercise. It's okay to pause. It's okay to reset, and get things around because, safety is primary. And it's like, well, I didn't want to be embarrassed in front of the camera. Good for you that you called a timeout and got that taken care of. So that's a message for all our cohorts out there that have something. It's okay. It's absolutely
you never
okay.
know how the media is going to treat you on these sort of things. But fortunately, when they decide to put it on the evening news, they cut that part out. So they didn't say anything about it. It's like, okay, they were nice to us, but you don't always get that nice treatment from the media. Sometimes they throw stuff in there. It's like, why the hell did they put that in there?
Yeah.
I'll throw sort of a curve at that and say that I think, those are great learning opportunities so long as they're learning opportunities, and that, note is made that, hey, what are we going to do if we're faced with this in real life? I see so many drills and exercises, triage, for example, where people don't actually do anything in terms of assessment or treatment, simulated or otherwise. They simply look at a card that's sitting on top of this patient actor that has vital signs and an explanation of what their problem is. And that's a reading test. That's not a test in true triage. And I will tell you, I tried to thwart that once, most recently by giving my patient actors a card with vital signs. And I said, you need to memorize your pulse, respiration, and blood pressure numbers here. And you need to memorize those and put this card away. And then when you go in as a patient and they touch you, and I told them, where they're going to check for a pulse and, so on. So then give that number in exchange for what they actually get. Now, I was thwarted by ER staff that quickly found out that the patients had the cards and basically told them, oh, no, you have to give me the card. And they use the card to get their information, but you don't get a real sense of the time that it would take, the resources that you would need, and some of the challenges in truly assessing patients, unless you add some element of realism. And you can't do that throughout the entire huge complex exercise, but that's where the drills come in handy. So.
Yep.
Great,
Great one.
great content, guys. And hey, we're running up to that time now where, you know what time it is, Al? It's time to wrap up Readiness
It is.
Rewired, this episode, right? Any closing thoughts or reminders that come to mind to share? I think we've kind of sprinkled them throughout. Other than don't, if you're working with Al on an exercise, expect the unexpected.
Wow, thank
He's
you,
a
Chris.
magnet for it. Yeah.
The Bermuda Triangle of exercise planning and facilitation.
If anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. Well, anyway,
Yeah.
we appreciate everybody's time. If they're interested in subscribing, we certainly encourage them to do so on the YouTube channel. Mike, any specifics about how we want them to go about doing that?
Oh, well, hey, man, don't forget our email, readiness.rewired@gmail.com. Let us know if you have any questions, suggestions, comments. Appreciate the feedback. Click that subscribe button. Ring that bell so you know when we post something new. And how about a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you can't stand us or you like us? We'd love to hear it.
Thanks, everybody.